Daily life inside the walls. If the admission into a British asylum was the moment a person crossed the threshold into captivity, then daily life inside was the machinery that kept that captivity running. Because the true horror of the asylum was not always found in dramatic acts of violence. Not always in the famous scandals. Not always in the locked room, the restraint chair, the cold bath, the punishment, or the whisper of abuse behind a closed door. Sometimes the deeper horror was something slower. Something quieter. Something that unfolded hour after hour, day after day, year after year. It was the horror of routine. The horror of repetition. The horror of waking up in a place you did not choose, under rules you did not make, surrounded by suffering you could not escape, and realizing that this was not an interruption to life. This had become life. To understand British asylums, you have to understand that they were worlds. Not hospitals in the modern sense alone. Not just buildings with patients and doctors. They were entire enclosed systems, with their own sounds, rhythms, hierarchies, smells, punishments, expectations, and seasons of despair. Inside those walls, ordinary time took on a different texture. It stretched, curdled, repeated itself. A day could feel endless. A year could vanish. And the people living there were forced to move through this artificial world according to a strict institutional timetable that touched nearly every hour of their existence. But before we even speak about the timetable, we have to begin with the sound. Because every institution has a soundscape. Every building teaches people where they are by what they hear. And the British asylum had a soundscape unlike almost any other. Imagine dawn before sunrise. The building is still dark in places. The corridors hold on to the night chill. Moisture clings to old brick. Ward windows are grey with early morning light, the sky outside low and colourless. And then it begins. A bell. Sharp. Metallic. Unfriendly. Not the gentle bell of a village church across a green. Not the comforting bell of a family kitchen. But the bell of institution. A signal. A command. A sound that does not ask, but tells. Wake. Move. Rise. Obey. Then keys. Keys were among the defining sounds of asylum life. Heavy rings of them. Iron teeth striking against each other. A rattle before a lock turned. A metallic clink at a belt. A sudden jolt of sound in an otherwise quiet corridor. For staff, keys meant authority, movement, access. For patients, keys meant the opposite. They were the sound of someone else controlling distance, freedom, permission, and timing. A patient heard keys and knew that doors could open, but not by their hand. Knew that even space itself belonged to someone else. Footsteps followed. The measured tread of attendants making their rounds. Boot leather on stone. Shoes along polished corridors. A brisk walk during inspections. A hurried run when trouble broke out. A slow night step past rows of beds. Patients learned these footsteps. They could hear mood in them. Irritation. Fatigue. Discipline. Panic. Routine. Then came the doors. The opening and shutting of doors in a locked institution has its own emotional force. A door clicking shut behind you is not the same as a door swinging closed in a home. In an asylum, the slam of a ward door could travel through the entire nervous system. A reminder. You are inside. You are contained. You are still here. And these sounds never fully stopped. By day, there were voices in the halls. Attendants giving instructions. Patients muttering to themselves. Someone arguing. Someone laughing too loudly. Someone praying. Someone crying. There were meal trolleys squeaking over hard floors. Buckets being moved. Windows opened and shut. Brushes scraping. Laundry carts rolling. Metal dishes clattering in kitchens and dining rooms. By night, the building changed its voice, but did not fall silent. That is one of the things many survivors, witnesses, and later explorers of these institutions found deeply unsettling. Even at night, the asylum never truly slept. From the dormitory, from the side room, from the locked ward, from somewhere beyond the bend in the corridor, sounds continued. A cough. A groan. A sudden scream. A bed creaking. A patient talking in their sleep. Someone calling for their mother. Someone begging to go home. Someone laughing in the dark. A cry cut short by intervention. The dull sound of struggle. The murmur of staff. A key turning. A bolt sliding. Then quiet again. Not peaceful quiet. Waiting quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every next sound feel worse. And all of this echoed. That matters. These buildings were often long, high-ceilinged, tiled, stone-floored, and built in ways that allowed sound to travel. Noise did not remain neatly where it was produced. It moved. It carried. It blurred distance. A person might hear distress from 2 corridors away without ever seeing the face of the one who made the sound. That meant suffering could become atmospheric. Not an event, but a condition. A constant background presence. You could never fully shut it out. And then, after the bell and the keys and the first noises of the waking ward, the timetable took over. In theory, this timetable was part of treatment. Order was considered therapeutic. Regularity was thought to calm the disordered mind. Routine was believed to restore reason, discipline the body, and shape behavior into healthier forms. That was the official logic. And in some cases, structure may indeed have helped people whose lives outside had collapsed into chaos. But inside overcrowded and underfunded institutions, the same timetable often became something else. Not healing rhythm. Mechanical control. The day began early. Very early by modern standards. Patients were roused, sometimes before full daylight, depending on the institution and the era. In large wards, waking was rarely gentle. One person stirring became many. Blankets thrown back. Instructions called out. Attendants moving from bed to bed. The sleepy confusion of dozens of bodies trying to rise at once. Imagine a large dormitory. Rows of narrow beds. Thin mattresses. Blankets of rough institutional texture. A cold floor beneath bare feet. A faint smell of breath, damp fabric, chamber pots, and stale night air. The windows sweating with condensation. Some patients rise quickly from habit. Others need coaxing. Others resist. Some are so sedated, exhausted, elderly, or depressed that they move like the weight of the world has settled into their bones. And yet the routine does not slow for individual despair. The ward must get up. After waking came washing. This too depended on class, institution, staffing, and period, but in many asylums washing was communal, hurried, supervised, and stripped of privacy. Basins. Cold water in some periods or places. Shared facilities. Towels of rough cloth. Rows of patients attending to bodily needs under the eye of attendants or within earshot of others. For people already vulnerable, paranoid, traumatized, or ashamed, this could be humiliating. To be watched. To be rushed. To wash in a room that smelled of soap, wet stone, and other people's bodies. To stand in line while the institution processed morning cleanliness like a factory task. In better-run institutions, standards of hygiene might be enforced with a degree of consistency and care. In worse or overcrowded periods, the entire process could become grim. Too many bodies. Too little time. Too few staff. Not enough hot water. Linen stretched beyond freshness. Clothing reissued, repaired, reused. And always the smell. The smell of the asylum deserves its own place in the story, because smell is one of the most powerful makers of memory and dread. It was not one smell, but layers. disinfectant, soap, urine, boiled vegetables, stew, wet wool, damp linen, coal smoke, human sweat, medicine, dust, old brick after rain, sickness, menstruation, stale air trapped in wards, chamber pots, laundry steam, and beneath it all, the odor of too many lives compressed together. In overcrowded asylums, sanitation was a constant challenge. Modern viewers sometimes imagine hospitals as places of sharp antiseptic cleanliness, but many historic institutions battled endlessly against dirt, vermin, poor drainage, inadequate sewage systems, infrequent laundering, and the impossible demands created by hundreds or even thousands of residents. Shared toilets could be foul. Bathing schedules might be rigid but insufficient. Patients who were incontinent, severely ill, elderly, or unable to care for themselves required labor-intensive attention, and when staff were too few or too indifferent, degradation followed quickly. Dirty bedding, soiled clothing, skin conditions, infestation, a smell that no amount of surface scrubbing could completely erase. For patients, this was not just unpleasant. It was identity eroding. To live in an atmosphere where the body was constantly managed, exposed, washed, inspected, and sometimes neglected was to lose the illusion of ordinary privacy. And privacy, inside the asylum, was one of the first casualties. After washing came inspection. In many institutions, the body and behavior of the patient were subject to daily observation. Did they appear tidy? Had they obeyed? Were they agitated? Violent? Withdrawn? Had they slept? Had they eaten? Were they clean? Had they wet the bed? Had they self-harmed? Were they likely to disturb others? The asylum was a surveillance environment. Patients did not merely live there. They were monitored there. Not every second, perhaps, but enough that many learned the deep unease of always being potentially seen, assessed, and reported upon. In a home, a bad morning can remain private. In an asylum, it could become a note, a judgment, a sign. And because many patients shared wards, dormitories, and day rooms, they also lived exposed not only to staff, but to one another. This is one of the most psychologically exhausting aspects of asylum life. There was very little room to retreat from the distress of others. Imagine sitting down to breakfast not in a calm kitchen, but in a communal hall among people at radically different levels of suffering and functioning. One person may be deeply delusional, another nearly catatonic, another loudly abusive, another quietly terrified, another heavily sedated, another restless and pacing, another staring into space, another muttering, another weeping into their food. There is no easy escape from this. No bedroom door to close. No quiet corner truly your own. No guarantee that the person at the next table will not suddenly shout, throw something, collapse, or begin telling you about voices only they can hear. And then the meal itself arrives. Institutional food was one of the defining realities of asylum life. For some patients, especially those who had come from extreme poverty, regular meals may at first have seemed like an improvement over hunger outside. That truth should be remembered. But regular did not mean appetizing. And nourishing on paper did not always mean satisfying in practice. Menus varied by place and era, but across many British institutions, the food was plain, repetitive, economical, and designed to feed large populations at manageable cost. Porridge, bread, tea, broth, stew, boiled potatoes, gruel in earlier settings, cabbage, suet puddings, simple soups, occasional meat, sometimes of poor quality, cheese, milkware available. Institutional puddings. The food was often heavy, functional, and monotonous. Enough to sustain. Rarely enough to comfort. Think about the emotional meaning of food in ordinary life. Food at home can carry memory, culture, tenderness, celebration, family rhythm, even identity itself. Inside the asylum, food was usually stripped of these meanings. It was portion, schedule, distribution, consumption under supervision. And if the food was repetitive enough, as it often was, the meal ceased to break up the day with pleasure and instead became another reminder of sameness. The same bowls, the same steam rising from the same bland stew, the same bread handed out, the same weak tea, day after day, month after month, year after year. In some institutions and periods, nutritional standards improved with reform. In others, shortages, underfunding, corruption, or indifference meant quality suffered badly. Complaints about meager portions, poor cooking, stale bread, watery soup, and joyless meals were hardly uncommon across institutional life more broadly in Britain. And food could become a tool of power, a reward for compliance, a thing withheld in cases of disruption, a site of contest when patients refused to eat, whether from illness, protest, depression, delusion, fear of poisoning, or simple despair. To refuse institutional food could be treated as symptom. To demand different food could be treated as unreasonable. To eat eagerly could be one of the only sensory pleasures left. How many patients must have sat in those dining halls staring into bowls of porridge, not just hungry for flavor, but hungry for any reminder of ordinary life? After breakfast, the day divided according to category and capacity. This is important. The asylum was not simply a place where everyone wandered in madness through long corridors. It was structured. Patients were sorted. The quiet and the noisy. The working and the infirm. The recent and the chronic. The private and the pauper. The men and the women. The violent and the manageable. The hopeful cases and the supposedly incurable. These distinctions shaped the rest of the day. For many patients, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, work was considered part of treatment. This was linked to the philosophy of moral management, the idea that useful occupation could calm the mind, restore habits, and provide purpose. In theory, perhaps. In reality, work in asylums often sat uncomfortably between therapy and labor extraction. Men might be assigned to farms, gardens, workshops, maintenance, kitchens, or grounds work. Women might be sent to laundries, sewing rooms, wards, kitchens, cleaning duties, or domestic labor. This division reflected broader social ideas about gender as much as medical theory. Work was not merely about health. It was about order, routine, obedience, and, crucially, the running of the institution itself. Many asylums functioned partly through patient labor. Laundry had to be done, meals prepared, clothes mended, floors scrubbed, vegetables grown, boilers maintained, beds made, chapel cleaned, buildings serviced. A giant institution required endless work, and patients provided much of it. For some, labor truly may have offered a sense of relief from boredom, a modest restoration of structure, even a feeling of being useful. For others, it was simply unpaid drudgery performed in confinement. Imagine the laundry. Heat. Steam. The smell of damp linen and soap. The ache of repetitive movement. The endless sorting, scrubbing, lifting, rinsing, folding. Women working in long rooms with raw hands and tired backs while attendants supervise and the institution swallows every clean sheet without gratitude. Imagine the asylum farm. Mud. Cold air. Manure. Rows of vegetables. The rhythm of tools in earth. Patients working under an open sky that promises freedom but does not give it. The boundary wall still there in the distance. Even outside, still inside. Then there were those unfit for work. The elderly. The heavily sedated. The deeply melancholic. The frail. The delirious. the chronically psychotic, the physically ill. Their days could be worse in another way. Emptier. Longer. They sat in day rooms, paced corridors, stared from windows, rocked in chairs, slept in corners, repeated the same phrases, watched clocks, watched doors, waited for letters, waited for visitors, waited for meals, waited for a name to be called, waited for nothing. This was the great enemy of asylum life, not only fear, but boredom. Institutional boredom is not the boredom of having nothing amusing to do for an afternoon. It is a flattening of existence, a draining away of distinction between 1 hour and the next. A life in which stimulation is scarce, autonomy is minimal, and time itself becomes oppressive. Boredom in these settings could turn inward, becoming depression, apathy, irritability, aggression, or profound mental dulling. And because many patients had little meaningful control over their environment, even tiny events took on outsized emotional importance. A walk. A cigarette in later years. A letter. A visitor. A change in weather. A chapel service. A special meal at Christmas. Anything that broke the pattern could feel enormous. But the pattern always returned. Exercise and airing were also part of asylum routine. Again, in principle these reflected humane intentions. Fresh air was believed beneficial. Movement was considered healthy. Grounds and airing courts were meant to provide controlled outdoor access. But even here the dual nature of the asylum revealed itself. The exercise yard was often less like a garden of healing than a managed enclosure. A walled court. A gravel path. A patch of grass. Benches. Patients walking in circles beneath observation. No true freedom of movement. No wandering into town. No choosing solitude in the countryside. Only regulated air. Regulated walking. Regulated exposure to the sky. And for those in more disturbed wards, outdoor access could be even more restricted. Imagine standing in a walled yard on a cold British afternoon. Clouds hanging low. Your coat too thin. Other patients shuffling nearby. One muttering prayers. One muttering curses. One staring at birds flying over the wall. That image matters. Birds flying over the wall. Because in institutions like these, freedom was often visible, but untouchable. The town existed beyond. Families existed beyond. Fields and roads and markets and homes existed beyond. The patient could feel the air of the outside world on their skin and still remain utterly separated from it. Religious services were another regular feature of life in many British asylums. Chaplains served institutional communities. Attendance might be encouraged strongly or expected depending on the period and patient condition. Religion was woven into the moral language of reform, routine, and spiritual restoration. For some patients, chapel may have offered real comfort. A hymn remembered from childhood. A prayer that still felt like home. A structure for suffering. A place where grief could briefly enter sacred language instead of medical notes. But for others, especially those experiencing religious delusions, guilt, or terror, it could be complicated or distressing. And even apart from belief, chapel was another institutional movement of bodies. Another scheduled event. Another procession under supervision. Another public enactment of order. Meals broke up the day again at midday and evening, but never enough to disguise the sameness. Afternoon blurred into evening through more work, more sitting, more pacing, more observation. And then there were the wards themselves. To understand daily life, the viewer has to see the physical environment clearly. A ward in a British asylum could range from austere to bleak, from decently maintained to grimly overcrowded, depending on era and institution. But many shared common features: long rooms, sparse furnishings, hard surfaces, standard beds, little decoration, limited privacy, and an ever-present atmosphere of watchfulness. Rows of beds in dormitories. Narrow lockers or none at all. Windows set high or restricted in opening. Walls painted in utilitarian tones. Fireplaces or radiators depending on period. Benches. Plain chairs. Day rooms with worn tables. An office or observation point nearby. A side room for seclusion. A place every patient understood, whether or not they had been inside it. The seclusion room was the distilled logic of the asylum. When the ward could not absorb your disturbance, you were isolated from it. And even for those not secluded, the ward itself could feel like a theater of distress from which there was no exit. One patient cries at noon. Another strips naked at dusk. Another bangs the wall at midnight. Another sits smiling at nothing. Another refuses speech for weeks. Another erupts into rage over a spoon. Another begs staff every evening to let him leave. These things become part of the atmosphere. Constant exposure to others in distress could profoundly affect patients who were already frightened or fragile. The asylum did not simply treat mental suffering. It gathered it together, concentrated it, amplified it, made each person live amid the symptoms of many others. Think of what that does to the nerves over time. To never fully relax. To never know what sound might break out next. To be watched by staff and watched by fellow patients. To sleep in a room where someone sobs in the night. To wake and see the same exhausted faces again. To have no private place to grieve, rage, pray, or unravel. This is how the institution could produce emotional numbness. At first the patient may react strongly. Disgust. Fear. Pity. Shock. Anger. But then weeks pass. Months pass. And the extraordinary becomes ordinary. The shout no longer startles as much. The smell no longer registers the same way. The sight of someone being led away becomes routine. The dining hall noise becomes background. This adaptation may look like resilience, but sometimes it is closer to psychic surrender. A flattening. A dimming. A necessary deadening of response in order to survive the environment. And over everything hung uncertainty. Some patients knew why they were there in a broad sense. Some did not. Some believed discharge would come soon. Some stopped believing in discharge at all. That uncertainty infects the daily timetable itself. Routine feels different when it has an end point. It feels much darker when it might repeat forever. Wake. Wash. Inspect. Eat. Work or sit. Walk. Pray. Eat again. Return to ward. Bed check. Lights out. Then wake again. The same bell. The same corridor. The same locked door. The same faces. This repetition could strip time of its human meaning. Outside, years are marked by birthdays, weddings, jobs, school terms, seasons of family life, funerals, holidays, changes in fashion, births of children, small domestic dramas. Inside, those markers weaken. Time becomes institutional time. Measured by meal bells, ward rounds, bath days, visiting days, medication times, laundry cycles, chapel on Sunday, annual reports, occasional deaths, occasional admissions, and the long slow fading of memory. And in such places, even emotion could become regimented. Joy had limited room. Spontaneity was suspicious. Anger was dangerous. Grief was monitored. Intimacy was restricted. Romantic attachment was policed or prevented. Sexuality was controlled harshly. Friendships formed, yes, but under pressure, surveillance, and instability. Many patients therefore lived in a state somewhere between feeling too much and feeling nothing at all. That is the emotional climate of the asylum. Boredom so deep it becomes pain. Hopelessness interrupted by bursts of agitation. Sudden violence in a room that had seemed still. Sedation making bodies present but minds distant. The numbness of too many repeated days. And under it all, a terrible question? Is this treatment, or am I simply being worn down into manageability? Because manageability was often what institutions valued most. Not necessarily healing. Not necessarily understanding. Manageability. A quiet ward. A compliant patient. A person who no longer resists. A person who follows orders. A person who takes meals. Sleeps when told. Works when assigned. Stops asking difficult questions. Stops insisting they do not belong here. Stops calling attention to themselves. From the administrative point of view, this could look like improvement. From the inside, it might feel like defeat. And then night returned. Beds were checked. Ward order restored as much as possible. Lights dimmed or went out. Some patients lay exhausted enough to sleep immediately. Others dreaded the darkness. Night in an asylum could be worse than day. The structure loosened just enough for fears to swell. There were fewer distractions. No work duty to occupy the hands. No daytime movement to blunt dread. Just the body in bed and the building breathing around it. A distant cry. A cough in the dark. Someone whispering a prayer. Someone rising in confusion. The silhouette of a night attendant passing. Moonlight caught on iron bed frames. A patient staring upward, unable to stop thinking. About home. About children. About whether anyone remembered them. About whether tomorrow would be identical. About whether this was now the rest of life. This is the truth that the abandoned corridors cannot say out loud, but still somehow carry. Daily life inside British asylums was not only shaped by obvious cruelty. It was shaped by system. By repetition. By architecture. By regulated hunger and regulated movement. By endless observation. By poor privacy. By shared suffering. By the wearing down force of institutional time. A person did not need to be beaten every day to be changed by such a place. They only needed to live there long enough. Long enough for the bells to replace the rhythms of ordinary life. Long enough for the smell of the ward to become normal. Long enough for the sound of keys to enter the nervous system. Long enough for their own reflection to begin looking like that of an inmate rather than a person passing through. Long enough for hope to become scheduled, delayed, thinned, and finally exhausted. That was daily life inside the walls. Not one single horror, but 1,000 repeated diminishments. A world in which suffering could be spectacular, yes, but more often administrative. Routine. Measured. Normalized. And because it was normalized, it could continue for decades. So when people walk through the ruins of these institutions now, past peeling dormitories, rusted bed frames, silent day rooms, crumbling bath blocks, shattered chapel windows, and corridors still shaped by the memory of bells, they are walking through more than abandoned buildings. They are walking through the remains of a timetable that once governed human lives down to the hour. A timetable that promised order. Sometimes promised healing. But often delivered something colder. A life reduced to management. A mind worn down by repetition. A soul trapped in routine. And for many patients, the next stage of that routine was where the institution tightened its grip even further. Because once daily life had been established, the asylum did not simply observe behavior. It sought to shape it. Correct it. Discipline it. Control it. And that is where we begin to enter the darker territory of punishment, restraint, and the many ways these places enforced obedience in the name of care. Workers' treatment or forced labor. There was one idea that sat at the very heart of the asylum system, and on paper, it sounded almost noble. Work. Not punishment. Not exploitation. Not servitude. Work as healing. Work as structure. Work as medicine. For generations of asylum reformers, doctors, and administrators, labor was presented as one of the most important tools in restoring a disturbed mind. The belief was simple, elegant, and deeply persuasive to 19th century thinking. Idleness bred disorder, but routine could rebuild a broken person. A mind thrown into confusion might be calmed by rhythm. A person lost in despair might be steadied by purpose. Hands kept busy, bodies kept moving, days made predictable. These things, it was said, could soothe agitation, restrain destructive impulses, and gently return a patient to self-control. Inside that philosophy was an entire moral worldview. To many asylum authorities, work was not just something useful. It was something righteous. It was tied to discipline, morality, respectability, and social order. A productive person was viewed as healthier, more stable, more respectable, more governable. A person who worked was participating in the proper structure of life. So when asylum superintendents praised labor, they were not simply talking about activity. They were talking about character. They were talking about obedience. They were talking about reform. And in theory, some of this may even have seemed humane compared with what came before. Earlier systems of confinement had often been nakedly brutal. Chains, filth, passivity, neglect. Against that backdrop, encouraging patients to walk in gardens, sew clothes, tend vegetables, bake bread, scrub floors, mend boots, or help in workshops could be framed as progress. Activity was said to counter madness. Fresh air was said to calm the nerves. Routine was said to restore internal order. Even today, in a very different and more ethical sense, meaningful occupation can indeed help people who are struggling. Structure can matter. Purpose can matter. Dignity can matter. But inside the British asylum system, those ideas became entangled with something darker. Because as the institutions grew, so did their needs. These were not small places. They were vast. Whole internal worlds cut off from ordinary society. Massive buildings with endless corridors, staircases, courtyards, airing yards, kitchens, wards, laundries, boiler houses, chapels, infirmaries, stores, workshops, farms, dairies, bakeries, and mortuaries. Some housed hundreds. Others held well over 1,000. A few became almost like self-contained towns behind walls, consuming enormous quantities of coal, food, linen, soap, water, medicine, and labor every single day. And all of that had to be maintained. Meals had to be cooked. Clothes had to be washed. Floors had to be scrubbed. Beds had to be made. Shoes had to be repaired. Vegetables had to be grown. Fields had to be worked. Livestock had to be tended. Water had to be hauled. Sheets had to be boiled. Chamber pots had to be emptied. Corridors had to be swept. Walls had to be painted. Furnaces had to be fed. Buildings had to be cleaned again, and again, and again. The asylum, in other words, did not merely treat people. It had to run. And once that fact is understood, the language of therapeutic labor begins to look very different. Because patients were not only being given useful occupation, they were helping sustain the institution itself. In many places, they were absolutely essential to it. The asylum economy depended heavily on their labor. That is one of the great tensions at the center of asylum history. Work may have been sincerely described as beneficial by some doctors and administrators. And for some patients, in some moments, it may genuinely have felt better than endless idleness in a locked ward. But the same system that called labor therapeutic also relied on it financially. Patient work reduced costs. It made huge institutions cheaper to operate. It turned confined populations into a workforce that was largely unpaid, highly controllable, and already on site. And that is where the question becomes uncomfortable. When does treatment stop being treatment and become extraction? When does occupation become exploitation? When does routine become compulsion? When does helping out become the hidden machinery of an institution saving money on the backs of the people it has confined? To understand that, you have to picture the everyday reality. Imagine the morning beginning before the day has fully warmed. The ward stirs. Bells ring in distant corridors. Boots strike stone floors. Keys knock against belts. Attendants move through the room with practiced speed. Beds are straightened. Orders are given. Some patients wash sleep from their faces at basins in cold or lukewarm water. Others move slowly, sedated or dazed. Some resist the day from the very first moment. But for many, the schedule is already set. After breakfast, able-bodied patients are divided and directed. Men may be sent outside. Women may be directed inward. The pattern is not always absolute, but it is powerfully gendered. The men are often assigned to the grounds, the farm, the gardens, the workshops, the pathways, the fields, the outbuildings. They dig, lift, carry, sow, hoe, rake, chop, mend, haul, and repair. They clear leaves, trim hedges, maintain roads, work with tools, tend livestock, shovel earth, and move supplies from one part of the campus to another. On large asylum estates, male patients might help grow much of the produce used in the institution's own kitchens. Potatoes, cabbages, turnips, onions, carrots, beans, fruit in season. They could also work with pigs, cows, poultry, or dairy operations, depending on the size and function of the site. There was something deeply symbolic about this from the institutional point of view. The land itself became part of treatment. The open air, the rhythm of seasons, the discipline of agricultural labor, all were folded into the story that the asylum told about itself. Patients were not simply confined, the system implied. They were being restored through useful engagement with the world. But the institution also benefited in the most practical sense possible. A worked field fed the asylum. A tended dairy supplied the asylum. A maintained road served the asylum. A repaired fence protected the asylum. A cleaned courtyard beautified the asylum. A productive patient helped the balance sheet of the asylum. And so labor carried two meanings at once. Officially, it was cure. Operationally, it was utility. For women, the story was equally revealing, and often harsher in quieter ways. Female labor was commonly concentrated in the most repetitive, hidden, and exhausting internal work of the institution. Kitchens, sewing rooms, cleaning, domestic service, mending, bed making, peeling vegetables, scrubbing surfaces, carrying linens, folding clothes, needlework, polishing, dusting, endless tidying of spaces that would never stay tidy. The asylum reproduced the labor expectations of the outside world, but under confinement. Women were often placed into forms of work that mirrored domestic service and unpaid household labor, except now it occurred within an institution that also claimed it was medicine. And nowhere is that contradiction more vivid than in the laundry. The asylum laundry was one of the great engines of institutional life. It was also one of its most punishing spaces. To understand why, think about the sheer scale of what needed washing in a large asylum. Hundreds, sometimes well over 1,000 people, all generating sheets, blankets, undergarments, uniforms, towels, cloths, aprons, patient garments, staff items, and bedding soiled by illness, sweat, incontinence, menstrual blood, vomiting, infection, and the general wear of life in overcrowded wards. The volume was relentless. There was no pause. Clean linen was not a luxury in such a place. It was a necessity, and one in constant demand. So the laundry became an industrial chamber hidden inside the moral language of care. It was hot, airless, damp, filled with steam. The smell was thick, wet cloth, soap, sour linen, heat, disinfectant, and the organic residue of bodies. Water sloshed. Boilers hissed. Wooden carts creaked. Baskets were lifted and dragged. Cloth had to be sorted, soaked, scrubbed, wrung, boiled, dried, ironed, folded, stacked, and redistributed. The labor was repetitive beyond description. A cycle that did not end because the institution did not end. More sheets. More uniforms. More towels. More loads. Every day. Every week. Every season. For female patients assigned there, the laundry could be physically brutal. Hands chapped. Arms ached. Feet swelled. Backs burned. The steam soaked into skin and hair. The air could feel heavy enough to breathe like warm cloth. The work demanded endurance rather than imagination. It was monotonous, but not gentle. It was hidden, but not harmless. And because it was classed as useful occupation, its harshness could be disguised under official praise. An annual report might describe female patients as happily engaged in laundry work. But such language often flattened the reality. Useful to whom? Therapeutic in what dose? Chosen by whom? Beneficial under what conditions? That is where the moral fog thickens. Because some patients almost certainly did prefer work to emptiness. This matters. The story should not be simplified into a cartoon where every form of labor was uniformly experienced as torture by every person at every moment. Some people may have found relief in routine, in movement, in getting off a ward, in being outdoors, in having a task, in feeling temporarily like a person with a function rather than merely a body under observation. A patient suffering from crushing boredom might welcome the garden. Someone tormented by mental chaos might cling to repetitive sewing. Someone else might simply prefer the dairy, or the bakery, or the workshop, because it made the day pass. It could offer small islands of normality in a life otherwise defined by control. There is a human truth in that. People deprived of agency will often find meaning wherever they can. Even inside a coercive system, small forms of purpose can feel like survival. But that does not erase the coercion of the system itself. Because choice inside an asylum was rarely pure. What looked voluntary could be shaped by pressure, dependence, fear, or lack of alternatives. If the options are to sit for hours on a locked ward surrounded by distress, noise, idleness, and scrutiny, or to go work in the gardens, is that freedom? If compliance earns privileges, smoother treatment, better reputation with staff, perhaps more chances of parole or discharge, while refusal marks you as idle, difficult, irrational, or deteriorating, is that genuine consent? If the institution holds the power to interpret your behavior, then saying no becomes dangerous. That was one of the asylum's most troubling powers. Refusal itself could be pathologized. A patient unwilling to work might not simply be seen as someone declining a task. They could be judged lazy, defiant, uncooperative, morally weakened, or more deeply unwell. In that environment, not participating could be transformed into evidence against you. Resistance could be folded back into diagnosis. Protest could become symptom. And once that happens, consent becomes very difficult to separate from coercion. So when official records speak warmly of patient employment, historians have to read them with caution. The institution had every reason to present such labor in the best possible light. It justified the regime. It reinforced the moral authority of staff. It supported the idea that the asylum was reforming lives rather than merely containing them. And just as importantly, it concealed an economic truth. Patient labor saved money. A lot of it. Every bed made by a patient was labor not paid to a staff member. Every shirt mended by a patient was labor not purchased outside. Every field harvested by a patient offset food costs. Every floor scrubbed, corridor cleaned, loaf baked, wheelbarrow pushed, and sheet ironed reduced the burden on the asylum budget. Multiply that across years, across counties, across the entire institutional system, and the scale becomes impossible to ignore. These were not occasional chores. This was infrastructure. Human infrastructure. And because the workers were also the confined, the power imbalance was total. Think about how neatly the asylum system turned ideology into efficiency. Victorian and later institutional culture prized order, industriousness, and self-control. The asylum claimed it could restore all three. At the same time, it housed large populations of poor and vulnerable people whose labor could be used to maintain the place. The moral story and the economic story reinforced each other. Work was good for the patient. Work was good for the institution. Work proved the system was functioning. Work justified custody. Custody supplied labor. Labor sustained custody. Round and round it went. A closed circuit of discipline and usefulness. And this is where the dark side becomes especially clear. The asylum did not only confine disturbed minds. It reorganized human beings into institutional roles. The melancholic woman became laundry labor. The impoverished man became farm labor. The restless patient became workshop labor. The compliant patient became part of the daily machinery. The body entered as an object of care, and could become, very quickly, an object of utility. Even the language used by institutions could blur personhood in revealing ways. Patients were often described in aggregate, as manageable bodies, available labor, categories of usefulness. Some were quiet and industrious. Others employed in needlework. Others occupied on the farm. The wording sounds calm, practical, administrative. But beneath it lies a chilling reduction. A person whose life may have collapsed through grief, psychosis, childbirth trauma, epilepsy, dementia, abuse, or poverty is absorbed into the functional grammar of the institution. They are no longer only someone suffering. They are someone employed, useful, occupied, managed. And yet the emotional reality for the individual could be far messier. Imagine a woman standing for hours in the laundry, wrists aching, sleeves damp from steam, folding institutional linen that never seems to end. Around her are other women, some silent, some muttering, some quick with their hands, some moving with the slowed heaviness of sedation or depression. Perhaps one breaks into tears and keeps working. Perhaps another stares at the same sheet as though it belongs to another world. Perhaps one has been told this work is helping her recover. Perhaps she even half believes it. Perhaps she clings to that belief because the alternative is too bleak, that she is simply laboring inside the machine that has swallowed her life. Now imagine a man in the grounds beyond the main wards, digging in cold soil under a grey British sky. The air is sharp. His boots are damp. Somewhere behind him, the asylum rises in brick and stone, immense and watchful. From a distance, perhaps the scene looks peaceful, a patient outdoors, engaged in healthy labor, under supervision. But maybe he is not there because he chose the beauty of fresh air. Maybe he is there because there is nowhere else to go. Maybe he knows that refusing would bring consequences. Maybe the labor calms him. Maybe it humiliates him. Maybe both are true at once. That ambiguity, that uncomfortable coexistence, is one of the hardest things to confront in asylum history. The system was not always simple sadism. That would almost be easier to narrate. Instead, it often mixed paternalism, genuine belief, routine bureaucracy, structural cruelty, economic convenience, and moments of real human relief into one tangled reality. A doctor might sincerely think labor was therapeutic. A patient might sincerely feel better while gardening. An institution might still be exploiting that same patient to reduce operating costs. None of these facts cancel the others out. This is why the legacy remains so haunting. Because the asylum did not merely harm through spectacular brutality, though brutality absolutely existed. It also harmed through ordinary systems presented as benevolent. Through routines that looked reasonable. Through structures that sounded moral. Through language that made coercion appear kind. Through labor that could be described as healthy while also functioning as extraction. And perhaps that is why these histories still feel so chilling today. The darkness is not only in the locked room, the restraint chair, the shouted order, or the punitive ward. It is also in the polished annual report. The calm phrase, The bureaucratic sentence. The idea that exploitation can wear the face of care. The idea that an institution can persuade itself that what benefits itself also benefits the people inside it. Sometimes that may even partly be true. But partly true can be one of the most dangerous truths of all. Because it softens the edges. It hides the pressure. It turns necessity into virtue. And it makes abuse harder to name. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, work had become such a normalized part of institutional life that it was difficult to separate treatment from maintenance. Patients were expected to contribute if considered able. Whole asylum landscapes reflected this expectation. Farms expanded. Laundries thrived. Workshops functioned. Domestic systems absorbed female labor almost invisibly. The institution appeared orderly partly because those confined within it were helping produce that order. And all the while, the deeper question remained mostly unasked. Who truly benefited most? Was the patient being restored? Or was the institution being sustained? Was the labor meaningful? Or merely convenient? Was it chosen? Or was it simply the least bad option inside a place where nearly every important choice had already been taken away? Even now, when people explore abandoned British asylums and walk through the remains of old laundries, workshops, service corridors, boiler rooms, and estate buildings, they often feel something eerie that goes beyond ghost story atmosphere. The unease comes partly from recognition. These places were not only hospitals. They were systems. They were engines of order. They turned suffering into administration. They turned people into categories. They turned everyday labor into a moral ritual that kept the whole institution alive. And in the silent remnants of those spaces, the traces are still there. The outbuilding where uniforms were mended. The yard where vegetables were grown. The laundry floor where steam once clouded the air. The workshop bench worn smooth by use. The service tunnel where carts rolled past. The field boundary maintained by hands that may never have chosen to be there at all. The work is gone. The workers are gone. But the logic lingers. That is the real shadow hanging over this part of asylum history. Not merely that patients worked, but that the line between healing and exploitation was so easily crossed, and so often blurred, that even the institution itself may not always have admitted where one ended and the other began. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Because the British asylum did not always need open cruelty to dominate a life. Sometimes it only needed routine. A timetable. A moral explanation. A task repeated every day. A patient told that usefulness was recovery. A system quietly saving money while calling it care. Behind the walls, labor was supposed to restore dignity. Sometimes, perhaps, it offered fragments of it. But just as often, it served the institution first. And when a confined person's hands are busy keeping the machine running, while their freedom, voice, and future remain uncertain, the question becomes impossible to avoid. Was this therapy? Or was this forced labor wearing the respectable clothes of treatment? Women in British asylums. If the British asylum was a place where society hid away those it feared, misunderstood, or did not know how to care for, then for women, it often became something even more disturbing. Not simply a hospital. Not simply a prison. But a place where female pain could be reinterpreted, renamed, controlled, and buried beneath male authority. Because the story of women in British asylums is not only about mental illness. It is about power. It is about who was allowed to define sanity. Who was allowed to speak with authority. Whose suffering counted as legitimate. And whose suffering could be turned against them. Inside these institutions, women did not enter on equal terms. They entered a system shaped by doctors, magistrates, legislators, husbands, priests, superintendents, inspectors, and social norms that were overwhelmingly male. Their bodies were watched through male medical theories. Their emotions were interpreted through male assumptions. Their speech could be filtered through male skepticism. Their behavior was measured against ideals of femininity that demanded softness, obedience, modesty, sexual restraint, domestic usefulness, and emotional containment. And if a woman stepped too far outside those boundaries, whether through illness, trauma, grief, rage, exhaustion, sexuality, rebellion, or simple refusal, the consequences could be devastating. Because in the world that built the asylum, womanhood itself was often treated as medically unstable. A woman's body was believed to be governed by tides of biological and emotional weakness. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, menopause, sexual desire, sexual refusal, sorrow, irritability, weeping, silence, agitation, nervousness, and fatigue could all be interpreted not as human experiences within difficult lives, but as evidence of fragility, imbalance, or disorder. Female distress was rarely viewed in isolation from female biology. It was folded into it, explained by it, trapped within it. That meant women lived under a dangerous form of suspicion. A man's anger might be called temper. A woman's anger might be called instability. A man's grief might be seen as sorrow. A woman's grief might be seen as emotional excess. A man speaking forcefully might be assertive. A woman doing the same could be hysterical. That word, hysterical, hangs over the history of women in asylums like a stain. For centuries, hysteria became one of the most powerful and slippery labels applied to female suffering. It was not a single clear illness in the modern sense. It was a broad, shapeless category into which all kinds of distress could be poured. Anxiety, depression, sexual frustration, trauma, exhaustion, mood swings, seizure-like episodes, grief, nonconformity, outspokenness, withdrawal, sensitivity, defiance, pain without obvious physical explanation, behavior that made others uncomfortable, behavior that challenged expectations. The diagnosis was useful precisely because it was so vague. It could hold almost anything. And because it could hold almost anything, it could be used to discipline almost any woman who became inconvenient to the world around her. This is one of the darkest truths in the history of female confinement. Some women were not institutionalized because they were detached from reality in the way later psychiatry might define psychosis. Some were institutionalized because the society around them did not know what to do with female suffering unless it could transform that suffering into disorder. A woman in despair after repeated pregnancies. A wife worn down by violence in the home. A daughter considered uncontrollable. A widow overwhelmed by grief. A mother after childbirth, hearing voices or sinking into hopelessness. A young woman with seizures. A girl with a developmental disability. A woman who refused sex. A woman who pursued sex too openly. A woman who drank. A woman who shouted. A woman who would not submit. A woman who stopped speaking. A woman who cried too much. A woman who did not cry at all. The net could spread wide. And once female behavior was being judged not only medically but morally, it became terrifyingly easy for treatment and discipline to merge. That is the key to understanding women in British asylums. Their confinement often reflected more than diagnosis. It reflected discomfort, social discomfort, sexual discomfort, domestic discomfort, moral discomfort. The fear produced when women did not perform femininity correctly. Because femininity in the 19th and early 20th century was narrow, and often cruelly policed. A good woman was expected to be patient, self-sacrificing, sexually respectable, emotionally controlled, and naturally suited to caregiving and domestic life. She was supposed to endure hardship quietly, to serve, to soothe, to bear children if married, to mourn properly but not excessively, to defer, to contain herself. But real women, of course, were living real lives. They were exhausted, abused, bereaved, underfed, overworked, pregnant again and again. Subjected to marital expectations they could not escape. Denied economic independence. Denied legal power. Denied educational and political authority. And under all that pressure, many broke down. Or resisted. Or both. Yet the system surrounding them often refused to read their suffering in social terms. Instead of asking what had happened to a woman, authorities frequently asked what was wrong with her. Instead of seeing distress as the understandable consequence of brutal conditions, they turned it into defect. Instead of asking whether domestic life itself could be oppressive, they medicalized the woman who could no longer endure it. This is where the asylum becomes not only a place of confinement, but a mirror of the society that created it. Because women often arrived carrying injuries the institution itself could barely name. Not only mental illness in any narrow sense, but the psychological weight of life under constraint. Imagine the married woman trapped in a violent home, her moods becoming erratic, her sleep broken, her nerves shattered, her speech sharp with fear and resentment. In another world, she might be recognized as traumatized. In the world of the asylum, she might be described as unstable, excitable, irrational, difficult, or hysterical. Imagine the woman who has lost child after child, or watched infants die, or survived difficult births, or buried family members one after another, until grief no longer behaves in tidy socially acceptable ways. She cannot stop crying. Or she goes numb. Or she becomes agitated. Or she speaks strangely. Or she wanders. Or she ceases to care for herself. Does anyone see a human being collapsing under sorrow? Or do they see a female mind gone wrong? Imagine the woman who simply cannot endure the domestic role expected of her. She refuses marriage. Or fails at household tasks. Or speaks too freely. Or rejects obedience. Or resents the life laid out before her. In a society that treated womanly conformity as natural, such resistance could easily be interpreted as pathology. In that sense, the asylum often did not just contain women who were unwell. It also contained women who had become intolerable to the order around them. And that order had powerful tools. One of the most disturbing features of this history is the role played by dependents within marriage and family life. Women, especially married women, often had far less control over property, income, legal standing, and public credibility than men. Their lives were structurally dependent. That dependency created vulnerability. A husband's testimony could carry enormous weight. Family members could frame a woman's behavior in ways she struggled to contest. Doctors and officials often listened to the people already recognized as respectable authorities, not to the frightened woman being described as unstable. This does not mean that every husband was malicious, or that every family acted cynically. Some relatives were desperate, overwhelmed, frightened, and genuinely trying to secure help in a world with limited support. That is important. But the structure itself was dangerous. Because it created opportunities for domestic conflict to be reinterpreted as female illness. A marriage collapsing under cruelty, resentment, infidelity, or financial strain could become a story about the wife's nerves. A woman furious at her circumstances could be described as insane. A woman resisting her husband's control could be classed as disordered. A woman whose sexuality violated expectation could be seen as depraved and unstable. A woman whose speech threatened family reputation might be silenced behind walls. Once the machinery of certification began moving, her own voice might matter very little. And this is what makes female confinement especially chilling. The woman most in need of being believed was often the least likely to be believed. Because if she protested, the protest itself could be turned into proof. If she shouted, she was irrational. If she wept, she was unstable. If she denied the claims made against her, she was delusional. If she begged to go home, she was excitable. If she accused others of cruelty, she might be dismissed as paranoid. The institution had a devastating ability to convert a woman's defense of herself into evidence against herself. Her words could disappear into the diagnosis. Her identity could disappear into the case notes. The label could swallow the person whole. And for women, perhaps no area reveals the tragic consequences of this more powerfully than childbirth and the period after it. Postpartum mental illness existed long before modern psychiatry had language to understand it properly. Women after childbirth could experience severe depression, disorientation, terror, obsessive thoughts, hallucinations, delusions, sleeplessness, emotional collapse, or complete psychological rupture. Some suffered quietly. Some became suicidal. Some became unable to care for themselves or their babies. Some entered states of psychosis so severe they lost contact with reality entirely. Today, we would recognize these as serious and urgent conditions requiring compassion, support, medical care, safety, and careful understanding, but in the asylum era, postpartum suffering was often wrapped in shame, fear, and misunderstanding. The new mother was expected to embody tenderness, instinct, and gratitude. To be maternal. To be calm. To be fulfilled. So when a woman after childbirth became distressed, detached, terrified, aggressive, suicidal, or psychotic, it could be experienced by those around her not only as illness, but as a horrifying violation of ideal motherhood itself. The mother who did not feel joy. The mother who feared her baby. The mother who heard voices. The mother who raved, wept, or refused food. The mother who seemed empty. The mother who spoke of death. Such women could quickly become objects of alarm. And because there was often little meaningful community support, little psychological understanding, and enormous social stigma, the response could become custodial rather than nurturing. She might be sent away. Not held through the crisis, removed from it, not supported close to home, separated from home. Not treated as a mother in desperate need, transformed into a patient under supervision. That journey must have been unimaginably brutal. To give birth, to collapse, to be judged, and then to be carried into an institution where your distress was recorded, observed, and classified while your child remained elsewhere, that is not merely a medical story. It is a story of rupture. A rupture between mother and infant. A rupture between woman and family. A rupture between suffering and understanding. And in some cases, the outcomes were tragic in the deepest sense. Women who might have recovered with tenderness and time instead entered institutions where routine, surveillance, sedation, isolation, and stigma shaped their days. Some improved. Some did not. Some remained for months. Some for years. Some never came fully back into the lives they had before. And even beyond childbirth, the female body remained a site of institutional interpretation and control. Menstruation could be noted as part of mental explanation. Menopause could be linked to mental instability. Sexual behavior was heavily moralized. A woman deemed too sexual, insufficiently modest, promiscuous, adulterous, or otherwise outside accepted sexual norms might be viewed not only as morally suspect, but medically suspect. Desire itself could be pathologized when expressed by women outside narrow, respectable boundaries. On the other hand, withdrawal, numbness, aversion, and emotional shutdown could also be taken as signs of female disorder. In other words, women could be trapped at both extremes. Too much feeling meant illness. Too little feeling meant illness. Too much desire meant illness. Too little desire meant illness. There was often no safe middle. Only scrutiny. And once a woman was inside the asylum, sexual vulnerability did not end with diagnosis. In many ways, it deepened. This is one of the most painful and difficult parts of the story. An asylum was a profoundly unequal environment. Staff controlled movement, privacy, records, discipline, privileges, contact with the outside world, and the credibility of testimony. Patients, especially female patients, occupied a structurally weak position. Their bodies could be examined, watched, bathed, dressed, restrained, medicated, and discussed. Their claims might be doubted by default. Their dignity could be eroded not only by deliberate cruelty, but by the everyday stripping away of privacy and autonomy. That alone created vulnerability. To be dependent on institutional power for nearly every aspect of life, when to sleep, what to wear, when to bathe, whether letters were sent, whether visits were allowed, whether complaints were taken seriously, meant that women could be exposed to humiliation with almost no safe avenue of resistance. And where power is unequal, the possibility of abuse always grows. This does not mean every asylum functioned as a site of constant sexual predation. History is rarely that simple. But the conditions for exploitation absolutely existed: confined women, male authority, restricted credibility, institutional secrecy, and the ever-present risk that any accusation made by a female patient might be dismissed as fantasy, delusion, attention-seeking, or disease. In such a world, proving mistreatment could become nearly impossible. Imagine the terror of that. To know something degrading or violating had happened, whether harassment, coercion, inappropriate examination, assault, or some quieter abuse of vulnerability, and to understand that your word already carried less value because you were inside an asylum. You were not just a woman. You were a woman officially marked as unsound. The very category imposed upon you could hollow out your ability to be believed. This is why institutional abuse is so haunting. It does not always require constant overt violence. Sometimes it rests on a simpler and more devastating fact: the victim knows that speaking may change nothing, or make things worse. And even when there was no explicit sexual abuse, there was often a loss of bodily dignity so total it became its own kind of injury. Women were searched, observed, undressed, bathed under supervision, moved through wards without privacy, placed in institutional clothing, separated from the personal objects that marked them as daughters, wives, mothers, sisters, workers, individuals. Their appearance could be regulated, their routines flattened, their shame made ordinary. The institution did not need to physically violate every woman in order to degrade womanhood. Sometimes the degradation lived in repetition, in being constantly watched, in never fully being alone, in no longer owning your own body as private space. And then there is the long tragedy. Perhaps the most heartbreaking one of all. The woman who does not leave. This is where the asylum's cruelty stretches across time. Not merely as a crisis, but as an entire life. A young woman enters in her 20s after breakdown, postpartum collapse, trauma, epilepsy, family conflict, learning disability, or grief that the world around her cannot absorb. Perhaps she is admitted in confusion. Perhaps she believes it is temporary. Perhaps her family intends to retrieve her. Perhaps she even improves after some months. But the machinery of release is slow, uncertain, and shaped by forces beyond her control. Her family drifts away, or cannot support her, or is ashamed, or dies. Or she is considered too fragile, too difficult, too institutionalized, too inconvenient to rejoin ordinary life. And the years begin to gather. At first she is the young patient. Then she is simply one of the women on the ward. Then one of the long-stay women. Then one of the older women. Then one of the silent figures who seem to have always been there. Think about what that means. To arrive as a person with memories of streets, seasons, choices, private dreams, family tensions, unfinished love, ordinary clothes, familiar meals, and a name spoken by people who knew you before the institution, and then, year by year, to be thinned into routine. The ward becomes your world. The bell becomes your clock. The matron becomes your authority. The laundry, chapel, airing court, dormitory, treatment room, dining hall, these become the geography of your existence. You age where you were confined. You lose friends there. You lose beauty there. You lose health there. Perhaps you lose speech there. And one day, the woman who entered in crisis is now middle-aged behind walls. Then elderly behind walls. Her youth vanished not in the life she imagined, but in institutional repetition. This is one of the darkest images in the entire asylum story, not the dramatic moment of madness, but the slow erasure of a female life. A whole biography absorbed by a system. A whole person worn down into category. Not because all hope vanished in one terrible night, but because the institution was built to continue, and continue, and continue, until time itself became a method of control. And in that slow attrition, womanhood was transformed. The lively girl becomes the quiet patient. The angry wife becomes the chronic case. The grieving mother becomes the disturbed inmate. The exhausted woman becomes the aged ward resident. The sharp-featured young face softens, then hardens, then fades. Hair grays. Hands thicken. Back bends. Memories loosen. Visitors stop coming. New nurses do not know who she once was. The records preserve a few sentences. But the life itself, the real inner life, disappears into silence. This is why abandoned women's wards feel so profoundly sad when people walk through them today. Because they hold not only the memory of distress, but the memory of lives flattened by institutional time. Lives that did not explode spectacularly, but slowly dimmed. Lives that may have begun in sorrow and ended in obscurity. Lives interpreted, managed, and filed by others. Lives that remind us how easily society can turn female suffering into a permanent condition when it cannot tolerate its complexity. And perhaps that is the deepest horror here. Women often came to the asylum carrying pain shaped by the world outside, by patriarchy, domestic burden, reproductive trauma, abuse, poverty, grief, and the impossible demand to remain gentle through all of it. But once inside, the institution rarely resolved those forces. More often, it absorbed their consequences. The asylum did not create every wound. But it often captured wounded women and held them inside a system that reflected the same unequal society that had broken them. That is why the story is bigger than medicine. It is a story about what happens when authority belongs mostly to men, and suffering is lived mostly in female bodies, and the language of diagnosis becomes a way of disciplining what the culture cannot comfortably hear. A woman says she is overwhelmed. A woman says she is terrified. A woman says she is furious. A woman says she cannot endure this life. A woman says something is wrong. And instead of asking what has been done to her, the system asks how to classify her. That is the shadow hanging over women in British asylums. Not only that many were genuinely ill. They were. Not only that many needed care. They did. But that the care available to them was filtered through suspicion, moral judgment, biological reduction, and institutional power. Their pain was medicalized. Their resistance was pathologized. Their vulnerability was magnified. Their dependency was exploited. And their lives could vanish behind walls while the world outside called it treatment. In the end, the female ward was never just a medical space. It was also a social courtroom. A place where womanhood itself was judged. Where grief, sex, anger, motherhood, obedience, and identity were all measured against rules women had little role in writing. And those who failed the test could be locked away inside the architecture of male certainty. Some entered in crisis. Some entered in shame. Some entered in confusion. Some entered in shame. Some entered in confusion. Some entered because they were truly unwell. Some entered because no one understood them. Some entered because no one wanted them. And too many discovered that once a woman's suffering had been renamed as madness, the world could stop listening.